I am also the director of a research center called Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies that is supported by the US government and is responsible for 3 subregions: Central Asia, Russia, and East Central Europe. So we're one of 6 such centers it uses that's responsible for preparing the next generation of experts. We're not an advocate of any of those places. We don't parade their values. Our job is to train experts, and there are experts sitting, young experts sitting here amongst you in the audience that are the next generation of people that will be the defining intellectuals for advice and expertise as we move forward in the years ahead. So we run PhD programs, we send them places, we get their language skills better, we teach them in history, Bill Chase, and in political science, and a number of other fields. So our job is to train experts, not to do advocacy work. Make a note. In any event, I'm really glad to see such a crowd. I'm going to try to keep this short. Make sure you turn your cell phones off. We're probably here for just over an hour, only because the escalators will stop, the elevator, the lift will stop, and the building will shut down, and we'll be stuck here until Monday morning. So we have to move fairly quickly ahead of time, and I hope you'll help me not feel that it's too rushed. Anton's biography you can read on the web. I can tell from this crowd that many of you already know his biography. Let me very briefly, in passing, mention that he studied at MGU, Moscow State University, at IMLI, at Institute for World Literature, imени Gorkova, Academy of Sciences. He worked at Echo Moskvy and a number of different newspapers and periodicals. Eventually, he's perhaps best known, and perhaps you know him best, from Вечерний Ургант, where he made weekly television appearances talking about cinema, but also about culture more broadly. And also, he's a scholar, where most of us, if we were the kind of scholar that he is, we would consider that already enough. But he's not only a full-blown scholar, I'll mention a couple of his works in just a second, but also a full-blown television personality and a full-blown editor-in-chief of Искусство кино, Cinema Art, our major journal that we all would digest routinely every time it would come out. It was our guiding light, our North Star for cinema. Of his scholarly works, the best known is a book on Lars von Trier, a book on Takeshi Kitano, a book on Alexei German, the Soviet director whom we hold in the highest possible esteem, and a book called Ulovka. Is it 21 or 21? 21. Ulovka, so it would be trick number 21, or trick of the 21st century. Essays on cinema of the new era. So this is also somebody whom one would envy in terms of his scholarly accomplishments. He's won many more prizes than I will mention here. In fact, I'll mention none of them, because he's smarter than any of the prizes he's gotten, and more interesting than any of the prizes he's gotten. It's a remarkable achievement. And also, I think many of us also know him from Radio Dolin. Those of you who are taking the remote part of this experience, the students of Russian, first, second, and third year Russian that are listening in on this, you really want to improve your Russian with no pain whatsoever, listen to Radio Dolin. It's so interesting, and you won't mind learning things. So it's a good way to practice your Russian. Now, I want to sit down and get this started in just a second, but before I do this, I'm morally obligated to thank Katie Manukian. Could you raise your hand so we know where you are? Bex. Olga Vivova, who's going to see you. Marina Davidson, who's our troubleshooter. And also members of the Pitt Film Symposium, who for the last 25 years have organized screenings of Chechen films, of Russian films, of Central Asian films, of Moldovan films, of Ukrainian films, and so on and so forth. Are there people here from the Russian Film Symposium and the Ukrainian Film Symposium? Zhana, yes. Very briefly, let me show you what the graduate students do. Each May, they make their own posters, they design their own posters. This is one done by Yeva Ivanilova from 2 times ago, of Ukrainian cinemas, that was pulled together right after the invasion happened. And they also design their own t-shirts for every event. This is, in fact, not only the last t-shirt from our Ukrainian festival with all the films on the back, but I'm giving it to Natasha if she's here. She's out there. All right,
Behind the door.
okay. So I'm giving it to you. This is the last one we have as an artifact of the graduate students that work so hard each year in pulling this together. So this is a kind of a massive endeavor, and we're very lucky to have such colleagues. We should say before going any further, I know it's been said before, but it needs to be said every time, that we unequivocally condemn the unprovoked attack by the Russian Federation on the sovereignty of Ukraine. We decry the war crimes that came out of it. We decry the disinformation that continues to come out of it. And I thought, because it's so difficult to say anything new that you haven't heard before, I thought that I would turn to the words of Karamurza just before, in his final speech, before he was convicted and sent to prison for 25 years, because his words ring true to me. They're brief and they're chilling. The day will come when the darkness will dissipate, when black will be called black and white will be called white, when at the official level it will be recognized that 2 times 2 is still 4, when a war will be called a war and a usurper a usurper. So lest anything slip in that throws that into doubt, it's at the center of our caring and at the center of activity. And a number of people here from Pitt have been very active in fundraising and raising money and putting on events that are around that. Now let me tell you what we're going to do in the next hour, because it's unbearably hot and I appreciate your patience here. You have 2 audiences, one is here and one is online, of undergraduate students studying Russian. So we must attend to both of these audiences. The first half is going to be me in dialogue with Anton. The second half is going to be you. Because of the heat, I might even turn it over to you a little quicker so that you won't fall into a coma and wonder when you'll finally get to speak to Anton. Of what I want to ask in my half of it, or my 1/3 of it, I've broken it into 3 clusters. The first cluster has to do with the cultural context, and that will probably be 1 question only, cultural context. The next question that I'd like to ask is slightly larger. It has to do with the industry background of cinema and television and festivals and so forth. And then the third and last cluster, probably also only 1 question, is the current political climate. Of course he's not an expert, but the trauma that he's gone through, just as the trauma that many of you have gone through, is an interesting take on what his own experiences have been about exile, about relocanti, about Latvia, conceivably about Israel, and if we stray very far, even about Prigozhin or Suleimani, who knows.
No,
So-
Anton is an expert
Got
of Prigozhin. Anton is definitely an expert in Prigozhin. That's why we're all here for.
well, we're going to see, aren't we? We're going to see, we're going to see. So my first question then, I'm going to sit down in just a second, but my first question really has to do with the Lebenswelt. I'm going to sit here because I'm really tired of standing and running all day. Has to do with what one might think of as the life world of the Lebenswelt of the Moscow intelligentsia. Some of you won't be interested in this, but let me set up the question. I think of no other family that perhaps so much captures what is for me the concept of the Moscow intelligentsia. Anton's mother, Veronika, whom you might know as a singer, or the son, Oleg, whom you might know as a theater director, and so forth. Veronika grew up with piano lessons and books, not just Soviet and Russian classics, but also, for example, with Wizard of Oz, with Leon Feuchtwanger, Mayne Reid, who was one of the greatest Soviet writers. Although there was Jewish background, it was typically muted, understated, and only came more evident later on in Veronika's life. Veronika was in her mother's womb when her mother defended her medical dissertation. It was Bulat Akujava who put the mother's work forward, and through Bulat Akujava we came to know Visborg, Gradnitsky, Matveeva, and Erkenev. In other words, you can see that this is a stew that's familiar particularly to some of the people of my generation in the audience today. We lived through the 60s and 70s and 80s steeped in this kind of notion of what the intelligentsia constitutes. And therefore my question has to do with this. It's somewhat of a painful question, but what are the chances that this intelligentsia is likely to survive in a way that we will recognize it? one could say that the intelligentsia survived Stalin, in part because you couldn't leave. There were no exit visas. The difference here with the so-called fifth wave, if we can call it that, is that will they survive Putin? If they can pack up their suitcase and go, if they have no choice but to pack up their suitcase and go, what then is the fate of that intelligentsia? We can take Moscow, we can take any other city. But I guess my first question to you, as somebody who has been, in a sense, born into multi-generationally this experience of the Soviet intelligentsia, is this the end? Is it a toy that's broken? Or is it an organism that can regrow itself somehow? How do you see the future for that group of people?
Well, first of all, we have no idea about the future. That's the problem, and we even not really sure about the past, because what is the survival? Did it survive really the civil war 100 years ago? We don't know. Can we say, that's a question of Dr. Zhivago, for example. Can we say that intelligentsia of 30s is the same intelligentsia of pre-revolution? Or the true intelligentsia flew away to the west and was dispersed and disappeared in a sort and became a part of Western culture? Or was the intelligentsia of 60s, of 60s the same? Or was it regrown, absolutely new generation of intellectuals? Was the perestroika intelligentsia the same as the people of 50s or 60s? We don't know. And what is the intelligentsia of 90s, where majority of people changed the field of work or flew to the west again, or decided to go to business or to some other, or to politics, and what is the survival? Recently, I think yesterday was published a new column by Konstantin Bogomolov, who is also intelligentsia to the core, and he is someone from multi-generations of intellectuals. Actually, we entered the Moscow University together. We were writing the entrance work, the сочинение together. Never knew each other at the time. The year of was 92, I suppose. So 1 year after the Soviet Union disappeared. And after this, he became a theater and sometimes a film director. And then we were friends, and now he is head of the theater. And he's writing purely propagandist texts about traitors who flew to the West. Is it the survival, or it's the death of intelligentsia? What is the answer? I have no idea. The survival is to go to other country, to leave your home behind, to your work, everything you did before. But to keep something important for you, even in Facebook, or survival is to keep your house in Moscow and your work and your audience, but to betray some very important thing. What is the important thing?
I remember the quote that Merab Mamardashvili once said, something like, to say that it died would be to assume that it had ever lived in the first place.
Absolutely.
So there's that aspect of it as well.
So it's a difficult question, not because we don't know the future, but even the past and the present are in the dark now. And what do people really think when they're not free to express their feelings, when it's really risky? Maybe in a couple of years the regime will change, and Kostya Bogomolov will say that it was all the cover and the irony, and what would we answer him? Because at the same time, he's not someone who shoot people, he's not at the war himself, he's not saying let's go to the war, let's kill Ukrainians, no. He's just, researching Some deep philosophical, ethical questions, which is permitted to intellectual, and it's kind of freedom too. So I mean, it's complicated.
When I was preparing for this conversation, I began reading your mother's essays on Jewish.ru, very interesting essays from about 2010 to about 2015, and the most painful one for me was one that she published in October. I'll say it in Russian and then I'll translate it, it's very short. She wrote, «Страшнее, чем последнее десятилетие в России, думаю, не будет». 2015. Yeah.
She's very optimistic.
Yeah, very optimistic. Yeah, and she had spoken with some regret about not having left with the third wave. Oh, I didn't say it in English. I'm afraid that I think that in the last, it won't be any worse in Russia than it has been in the last 10 years. In other words, it's before the invasion that she writes it, 2015 that she writes this, and she said the worst is behind us.
We all had an impression that 2014, it was the worst moment. And I remember, maybe it's a personal touch, but let me say that. It was the day after Donbass already started, and Crimea was annexed. And it was a day when Putin asked Soviet Federation, the parliament, to allow him to start the war if he wants to. And at this evening, I had my program, Вечерний Ургант. I was the national TV, and the whole redaction, everyone were really afraid that tomorrow the country and the world will change forever. The war will start. It was 2014 again, and it didn't. So we thought that it was just for show. Of course, Crimea and Donbass was horrible, but it wasn't full-scale war. And we were thinking that somehow, maybe it will be arranged. With the West, the America, it will be arranged somehow. So 2015, 16 was worse and worse, but we still had some illusions. Well, we still had some illusions the day before the invasion, 1.5 years ago, started. But I mean, speaking on a personal level about my family, our choice was not to leave Russia, to stay inside Russia, and to fight how we could fight. With my mother, it's poetry and songs. For me, it's my articles, my let's say, as an example, they in parliament, they have new law against homosexuals. And we at Искусство Кино, we organizing a retrospective of Pedro Almodovar and the book about him. It's our way to fight.
Yeah.
And we see the full audience of people watching these films and saying, it's all bullshit, it's not serious, this law, it doesn't work. People, not homophobic, they want to see these films, they want to read these books, it's okay. But now it seems to be a big illusion again. And a week before my family, me, my wife, our kids, we left Russia, we were completely confident that we will never leave Russia. Never. We will stay to fight. You know, and many people like me, they left Russia having no idea a month before that they will have to leave. And maybe there are some regrets, we never left before, and some part of my family left Russia before.
Yeah.
And
you have an aunt in Israel, is that correct?
I have aunt in Israel. I have some relatives here in America, even actually here near Pittsburgh. And my sister now lives upstate New York for I suppose 7 or 8 years already. And you know, but for us, it was a decision to stay. But still, everything changed, and we had to leave.
I'm wondering if I could pinpoint, skipping ahead in my questions to one that was one of the last ones I wanted to ask. And in a sense, it's a neurological question in the following sense. When 9/11 happened, a colleague of mine, a neurologist, said, this is great. Now we will have a time in history when your generation, Nancy, already has dementia. And we will ask you, where were you when you heard about 9/11? And if you can remember that, it's a way of measuring your ability to recall. And I remember, for example, my mother describing washing the dishes in the kitchen and the curtains when she heard about Pearl Harbor. It's a story of what kind of curtains there were that was passed from my mother to my brothers and me, and to our children who are now adults. But that neurological moment of it burning into your skull that will last forever. I'm wondering, did you have, when you actually realized that it's now the border has been crossed, that now it has happened, did you have that sensation of almost neurological jolt when you realized that life has changed? Or were you still able to conjure up some kind of voice, consoling voice that told you, well, it'll be little?
Well, consoling voices, we all have them, I suppose. But yes, by the way, I remember my 9/11. I was in Moscow, and we just moved to our new apartment. It was a teeny apartment, and on TV we were watching this, and NTV, which was the best television at the time, they literally had no words. They didn't know how to express what they see, and it was very expressive. But I think for me it was the early morning of 24th of February last year, and I woke up very early because I had a flight to Samara to have a lecture, something like today's event, and it was the early flight, so it was maybe 6 or 7 a.m. Or even before that, and as usual, I looked at the internet and I said that they started bombing Ukraine, and I cannot say that it was unbelievable. It was like the worst nightmare. I had this nightmare, of course, because everyone was saying that it's gonna happen. It can happen. And I was always on the side of people who thought that Putin is too pragmatic to do this. But I was still afraid because very early I was just a news reporter for Echo of Moscow, and I was there when they blew up the houses in Moscow in '99. So it was way before 9/11, I'm sorry to say. Our shock in Moscow was before.
Yeah.
And I had no doubt that it was organized by FSB. Truly. At the moment it was clear that it is organized. And we had this story in Eurasian. So I knew that Putin is capable of something terrible. And maybe some of you don't remember that, but at the time of Second Chechen War, it wasn't yet the informational blockade. We knew that something horrible was happening. The bombing of Grozny, it was there, it wasn't hidden. And also the shock of people in Russia accepting what's going on. It wasn't such a shock for me a year ago, because I remember when they bombed Grozny and we in Echo in Moscow given this information to people. It wasn't shock for many people. It was okay. It's not us who is bombing. It's not us who bombed. who's under the bombs. So it happens. Big people make big decisions for some reasons. So I knew that this is a frontier, and some people, even in my family, it's a normal reaction to a shock. On 24th of February, they were thinking that probably in 3, 4, 5 days, in a week, it will end.
Yeah.
Somehow. It will be organized. It will be a big dream. But no, I understood that it is the frontier. That's it. And Russia, as we knew it in the last 20 years, maybe even the last 30 years, the post-Soviet Russia, it ended here, at this day. It was the last day. It was the last day. And now, even some of my friends in Moscow, they have this illusion that it's still the same country, but it's not.
Yeah, and of course, with the apartment bombings in Moscow, and then the murder of somebody like Yuri Shikachikhin, for example, we knew that he was murdered, but there was no aftermath to that. There was no, he didn't even survive as a figure in our universe. He dropped from sight in a way that Politkovskaya did not drop from sight, but no one speaks today of Shikachikhin, as far as I can tell.
Even of Politkovskaya, it's not in the center of attention. I mean, we cannot say that it's remembered forever in Russia. Outside maybe, but.
So I'm aware that you probably have your own questions that you're formulating. I want to skip ahead to the end of my second cluster and ask a single question from that. Let me set up the question, I'll make it brief. We remember in school, of course, studying the 1920s, emigre culture leaving, the philosophers' steamers, which were in fact 2 steamers when the philosophers left. In fact, there's even a film made by one of the Kots about the philosophy steamer. And of course, then they formed their own izdательства, their own publishing houses in Paris and Berlin and a lot of different places. And many of those publishing houses existed for years and were joined by publishing houses of the second wave, and then the third wave, of course, even more robust, and so forth. So I think the problem was rather that when we, people like me, studied it in school, went through high school and university and graduate school, for us the emigre culture was always to the side. It won't surprise you that our job was Pushkin, Lermontov, Gogol, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Chekhov, Gorky, and so forth, maybe a little Gorky, but some Gorky. But it was always very mainstream. That emigre literature for us was something that you didn't want to specialize in because you might not get a job. And that's a legitimate worry for the faculty that has to place these students in good jobs and report to the dean, so we'll keep getting money and our cafedra stays open. It's a legitimate worry. But because of that, emigre literature was to some extent shunted to the side. And this was spoken of very articulately by such a figure as Karl Proffer. If you remember Karl Proffer from Artis, was very savage in the volume Tretya Volna about how we weren't taught to study the emigre literature. So my question, therefore, that's my line of thinking. My question is this: if this could be called uslovna, if this could be called the fifth wave, 1917, 1945, third wave, 1970s, fourth wave, 1991, more or less, shaky wave, but let's call it the fourth wave. And if we can call this the fifth wave, does it have a future? Will it cohere? Could it be possible to hope that because that fifth wave has a greater stickiness to it because of the internet, because of international travel, it's more likely to be coherent to ourselves and to each other, that it could be incorporated into syllabi and doctoral dissertations and research projects, that emigre culture now in the fifth wave could have a different kind of profile than the early ones? Is it too much to hope for that? I see that, for example, Belarus cinema is getting itself back up, that Mansky and Artdokfest is working very hard, that Radyansky is active still. Is it too much to hope that the fifth wave might present to us an opportunity to preserve itself?
No, I think it's possible. It all depends on on the future of Russia, because we are all still connected to Russia. And as a representative of Russia's culture and the idea of art without censorship, we must talk about Russia. Actually, now I found myself in a strange situation. For years, I was trying in Russia, inside Russia, not being representative of Russian culture, and being international as much as I can. Write books about American, Japanese, Chinese, Iranian, European film directors, not to focus on Russians. Russia is just a part of the world. And now, being a part from Russia, I feel the need to be representative of true Russia. It's too pretentious to say that, I know, but to talk about Russian culture, to talk about Russian culture under the censorship, and Russian culture, about Russian culture free from censorship, to free from censorship, to do whatever we want, whatever we can about it. So, is the world interested? It's a big question, and it depends on which part of the world we're talking about. Sometimes it's only for someone who's really specialized on Russian culture. Sometimes it's for everybody else. Sometimes a big part of Europe now, when we are at war, they don't want to hear about Russian culture of any kind, even culture of protest. They just don't want to know what Russian artists, intellectuals think about it.
And in the sports world as well, you see in the sports world,
Yeah.
those who will not shake hands with each other.
It's similar.
Very
It's similar.
Completely understandable. And so.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, in a way, we have to talk and to think. We have sometimes to stay quiet. And if you are quiet for too long, you can just disappear, because the only way intellectual can survive is to talk and to write and to be active.
I appreciated Loznitsa, the willingness that Loznitsa marshaled in order to take the kind of criticism that he drew upon himself in speaking against a complete boycott.
Yeah, the story of Loznitsa it's also a dramatic story. He was one of the first Ukrainian intellectual who was very strictly against Putin, against Russia. After Donbass happened, he was the first to make a film about it, and he refused to give any interviews, any public talk to Russian media, even oppositionary ones.
Yeah.
But now he is considered some kind of ally to Russians by Ukrainians,
Yes.
because he's opposed to complete boycott.
Yeah.
So it's complicated. I'm not Ukrainian. I'm not taking part of it. I just know that Loznitsa is a big artist, and he's very important for us.
And one could describe, in principle, one could describe his film Donbass as a Russophobe film. That's not the position that I'm taking, but one could well see that if you look at Donbass, it was jolting to me to see how explicit he was and how unadorned he was about the contempt for the situation.
Absolutely. So I don't know. You say that the internet gives some resources and force. Yes and no, because at the same time, sometimes social networks, internet gives us an illusion of audience, and the response, especially on Facebook and sometimes Twitter, can be too aggressive, and it's a wall of this aggression, which doesn't give us opportunity of real communication with real people, who in times of such an verbal aggression prefer to stay quiet again. So it's a situation, it's a labyrinth, and and sometimes without issue, without exit.
Yeah, because we're at a point, I mean, you may well ask, why did Reese not organize this event with a remote Zoom dimension to it? We didn't do it in part because everything happened very quickly, and because we would need to register people on Zoom, and because we don't have the staff resources to pull it all together instantly in enough time. That was one reason. But another reason, to be honest with you, is I think that it's easy to overlook the extent to which the emails that we get each time we hold an event, particularly one that is remotely on Zoom, the Naval and the tsunami of nasty verbal abuse that comes through, has a very bad psychiatric effect, not only on our guests whom we've invited, but also on the administrators that have nothing to do with the event. They simply have the address. They simply get up in the morning and log into the internet and receive the mail coming to Reese. And the constant abusive email that comes through is psychologically not good for somebody who works in our office. And it's for that reason, among others, that we decided, come, let's talk, be here in person, let's see each other, let's have our empathy be face to face. Because one of the problems is, and I'll try not to go on about this, but that kind of psychological damage is an invisible disability. You don't see people walking around having been traumatized. It's not visible on their body, but they have been very traumatized by the kind of arguments that you all know better than I. I am to the side of it, but that abuse it causes damage that's not visible, and we've decided therefore to respect that and not have, at this historical moment, not have a remote Zoom present here today. What we do have is a private Zoom of language students, and I think that was the compromise that we made. I was thinking that maybe I would try to shift over to questions from here. I'm going to do the best I can. You can see that this is not going to work very well. But I mean well, and I'm happy to try to set up a queue of questions that you might have, if you could just raise your hand. And if it's possible, identify yourself so that Anton knows with whom he's speaking.
Can we actually switch into Russian?
Пожалуйста. I'm not sure that we can do a simultaneous interpreting.
We don't need it. I think 99% here speak
I'll
Russian.
tell you. So I'm allowing you to speak in Russian. Go ahead, please.
Отлично. Антон, здравствуйте. В первую очередь, большое спасибо. Очень странно видеть вас в Питтсбурге. Еще 2 года назад я видел вас в Гоголь-центре или в театре на Малой Бронной, но тем не менее. Вы сами обозначили в начале вашего разговора про вашего однокурсника, который из театральных режиссеров переквалифицировался в эссеиста и манифестанта. Насколько вы считаете, он искренен, в первую очередь? И второй вопрос вот по поводу уехавших и оставшихся. Есть люди, которые уехали вынужденно, как Серебренников, как Бутусов, как, ну, по сути, которые остались. И продолжают делать очень качественный продукт. Это Додин, это Хабенский, это Миронов, как и другие. Они могли уехать, и тогда мы потеряли бы 3-4 очень хороших театра. Лебников снимает «Снегиря», очень хорошее кино, мог бы уехать. Вот как вы считаете, если вам не угрожает непосредственная физическая опасность, как мастер, как человек, который влияет на социум, как человек, который создает смыслы, контент, стоит ли ему остаться или уехать? Спасибо.
Should I answer in Russian or in...
Answer however you wish. We'll sort it out. It'll come up again and again, this language problem. Just do it. It's fine.
I think the biggest lesson I've learned during this very painful months, it's that it doesn't exist anymore, the word we. It's just me, just I. Everyone choose for himself or herself, and there's no rules for everybody. I mean, some people can stay in Moscow and do a good theater as a consolation or even as a silent, let's say, protest, and it's good, of course. But some people do, and then they go to prison, like Zhenya Berkovich with Svetlana Katrichuk. Does it mean that every theater person who is sincere should leave the country? I'm not sure. I don't know. It's just a risk. Do they have a risk when they leave the country? to stay jobless and not to find theater where to work and to express yourself? Sure. I know many people from theater world and world of cinema who just stay jobless somewhere in Israel or in Tunisia, in Yerevan, or in Moldova, just waiting for something to happen. So there is no answer. Everyone, and the same with sincerity. You know, sometimes even sincerity can be the mask. Sometimes sincerity can be the sort of a protection. So I try, again, speaking only for myself, I'm trying to be sincere always. And it was maybe the main reason for me why I had to leave, because I wanted to speak openly what I think is right to say openly. But it can be risky and it can be really dangerous nowadays in Russia, and sometimes even outside Russia it can be dangerous. You know, they have novichoks, and it's not just being paranoid. It's happening. Even with some public intellectual like Dmitry Bykov, who doesn't want to become next Russian president like Navalny or Yashin. Even for him, it's dangerous. So it can be dangerous to anyone who has audience.
Let's take another question. Yes, please introduce yourself. Say who you are. That's all.
My name is Lina, and first of all, I want to say thank you, Nancy, for inviting the members of the community.
I appreciate it.
We appreciate it. Anton, could you describe your feelings about the disillusion? You work so hard, and all your books and your articles, and now what I can imagine, the majority of people in Russia are pro-war. They send their children, their sons to war, their husbands. So you didn't get to their mind. So your audience is small? Thank you.
I have no idea how big is my audience, actually. It's an interesting question. Sociology doesn't work in countries like Russia. Totalitarian state, it doesn't work. You don't know really how many people are pro-war or anti-war. We don't know. We can have something like an answer if we, just potentially speaking, I don't think it's possible. Putin dies tomorrow and we have a free election and we have, let's say, Shoigu or Prigozhin on the one side and Navalny, who is freed from prison on the other side, or Yashin. And we can really choose. And then we can see how people will vote. But before that, we don't know. In a country like this, it's like sociology in Gulag or in prison. You're asking people, are you pro-war, when they know that being anti-war is to go to prison? Of course, you cannot trust their answers. I know that my audience is quite big, but if you take all audience who is going to cinema in Russia constantly, let's suppose every person who ever bought a ticket to cinema in Russia is my audience, and they all agree with me about Putin and war. It's a small minority. Do you think it's majority? No. The majority watch TV. They don't have. It's not my audience. It's audience of Первый канал, maybe, but not mine. Audience of Вечерний Ургант is minority. It's millions, but it's minority. Maybe 10%, maybe 15%. It's a lot, millions of people, but it's minority. So even if you trust official sociology of Putin, you can see by official numbers, you have this 15, 20 millions who are against war, officially speaking. They exist. So, I mean, it's not optimistic, I understand. It's totally pessimistic. We don't know anything about people, except that they don't have really political independence. And we don't know what they really think. I suppose, if you honestly ask people who are really pro-war and who are really ready to sacrifice yourself or your children for the war, it's a small minority. Because on the other side, all these very strict war censorship laws, they prove that you need to suppress any kind of anti-war opinion. So it means that possibly they in Kremlin, in Duma, they're really afraid of independent opinion. But we cannot hear it, and we cannot count it. And I don't really feel a disappointment on people. People, no, I don't. And actually I can say that I almost never was surprised by people. I mean, speaking of people I know personally, or famous people, I never was really disappointed in the last 15 months. I expected almost every reaction I had.
Katie, I'm reminding you that if your students want to pose questions, you'll give me a wave. Students, make Katie proud of you. I'm talking to you. Start asking some questions. Let's take another question from the hall. Yeah.
I have a question because your film critic, right, is one of your titles, and also over the past 25 years, you had a lot of film critics coming here to our Russian Film Symposium, and we've met a lot of them, right? But film criticism and the word criticism require also criticizing something, right? And in the current environment, in the current socio-political environment, can we even talk that criticism exists, and film criticism, and literary criticism, any kind of theater criticism, and that they can exist in their pure form, that they are not just, put in some kind of screen and we'll just talk about maybe the visuals, right? Maybe we'll talk a little bit about the plot, but we won't go into the analysis or the deeper, deep explanation what this film is actually about or what this play is actually about. So do you think that it's also the end of film, literary and theater criticism in
I mean,
Russia?
people like Katya Barabаш or Alena Solntseva
Does
or
Bulatova, yeah,
people
or
that are
Grabowski,
edge to their.
Yeah, so what is it? What's
No,
happening there?
I think criticism still exists because we still have social medias.
Yeah.
Only because of that. Putin actually destroyed all kind of media. The real media, the real journalism of Russia doesn't exist anymore. That's the main problem. And if we talk about critics, they're too smart for them. They cannot, FSB, they cannot really read and understand critics, what they mean. They're too smart. It's our benefit. But maybe I'm the dumbest of all, because I was the very first film critic and film person, by the way, who was proclaimed foreign agent. Number one.
Congratulations.
Yeah, nothing good about it, but it's just my reality. So I'm considered a dangerous person. But it's because I have big audience. Because I have big audience on YouTube, on TV. It's not because I'm smart or dumb, or don't have anything to do with it. I think art exists. Art existed even in Auschwitz or in Gulag. It's the nature of art. It just exists everywhere. You cannot kill art. It's impossible. It's like kill, I don't know, rain or wind. It's impossible. You can try your best, but you cannot kill it. So the criticism, it's part of it. because you cannot receive art if you don't understand it. And understanding of art comes with a criticism in any possible form. But I mean, Science or Искусство кино, the big magazines we had for years, thinking, reflecting cinema in quite deep form, they endangered now, of course, because no one, even good people, they don't want to spend money on it. It's not a right time, unfortunately. But I believe we will still have criticism after the war. You know, all wars they end one day. This war also, now it seems like eternal war, but it will end eventually. And art and criticism and independent politics, it will happen again. Like it or not, it will happen again. Russia is a huge country with a lot of people with different opinions. Even if now these opinions are hidden, you will hear it again, you will see it again. It will exist. And you asked me about my audience, for example. Nancy is right about the real audience, I mean, not online audience. It's a big difference. I travel a lot last months, everywhere. And I see full audiences pretty much everywhere. And in the country where I traveled for the first time in my life, like Moldova or Georgia, for the first time, never been there. And I see the same faces and I hear the same questions everywhere, pretty much everywhere, and America as well. This is my fourth public meeting here in America. I did one in New York, one in New Jersey, one in Chicago. People are similar everywhere, and this is the same people I met all over the country in Russia. And majority of them are still there. It's the same people. In Samara, it was the same people at the morning when the war started. And in the evening, I made a decision. It was before this crazy laws about pro-war laws that you cannot even say the word war. So the same evening, I said to organizer of this lecture that I will start with a speech about the war, because it's impossible at such evening to talk just about film. It's impossible. And they said, yeah, of course. And when I was talking about it, I was afraid a little bit. People may react in some unpleasant manner, but it was the universal applause in the audience. And when I was telling this story about this applause in Haifa, in Israel, one person in the audience said, yes, I was there in Samara. And other people from other part of the audience, yes, me too. You know? So, people are alive, they spread all over the world. Big part of them, I think the majority of them, still in Russia. And they will be in Russia when the war will end, and when Putin will end.
Now, I want to honor the students and give them a chance to ask a question. Then I've seen there was also a question in the about 4 or 5 rows back, and I'll get to you in just a second. We have maybe 20 minutes left, so if you'd like to pose a question, marshal your thoughts, and I'll be happy to call on you, Kate.
The question actually comes from one of our instructors in our English language program.
Talk loud enough that Bella can hear you.
Okay, the question comes from an instructor. Her name is Wignana. She wants to know that on the backdrop of all this, what do you think are the most meaningful, significant films from the years 2022 to 23 for the international viewer?
Well, it's very subjective. I don't think that there was a Russian film which is universally, you have to see Russian film from this couple of years. Maybe except Сказка by Sokurov, which is very important. It's really the final part of his series of films about dictators and dictatorships and totalitarian state and totalitarian mind. which is important to think about, because we love to think that totalitarian means total, so it's touched everyone. In a way, yes, but it still depends on some solitary persons, sometimes very funny and absurd persons, like a great dictator from Chaplin's film, and he depicts the similar characters using his historical chronics of real footage of Hitler or Stalin. I think it's a good history lesson for future. And speaking universally, there are many important films, but the most important document and art about this war is definitely Mariupolis 2 by Mantas Kvedaravičius.
Yeah.
Film by a Lithuanian filmmaker who was killed in Donbass, tortured and killed. He's a bravest guy. He was a bravest guy. His first film was actually about torture in Chechnya of Kadyrov. And then he made a documentary about Donbass war, Mariupolis, which was very successful. And after this, he moved to feature filmmaking. But when this war started, he came back to Mariupol, now bombed by Russian government. And under the bombs, he started to work on a film. Then he was killed, and his wife rescued his body and his material. And this material was edited a year ago for the film, and it's a great, I would say, experience, this film. And I think it will stay in history of cinema. And it is art. It's not only a testimony of what was going on. And otherwise, the film of Vitaly Mansky and Evgeny Tidorenko, Vostochny Front, Eastern Front, is very important. It's a collaboration of director who lives outside the war and the director who is inside the war, who is fighting the war. They did it together. And I believe we will see the new wave of new Ukrainian films, documentaries and feature films, which will be the strongest, one of the strongest waves of new European cinema. But it will be in near future, I hope. I hope the same for Russia, just like Germany and actually Japan. They had the strongest post-war cinema in 50s, in the 60s. Everything great about Japanese cinema, Kurosawa, post-war Ozu, Oshima, Imamura, great filmmakers. Even this year, we're all waiting for a new film by Hayao Miyazaki, who is the child of war. And The Wind Rises, his previous film 10 years ago, says a lot about this war, about participation in war, about what intellectual should and can do in times of war, about participation of intellectual in war. One of the strongest film about collaboration in war of intellectual, who is just an intellectual with his dream of making beautiful planes. And then these planes, they start bombing, people. And I believe, I hope that Oppenheimer will become the strongest film of this year. It's this rare case of prevision, of seeing through future, because it was for Christopher Nolan a project for many years. And now I'm having chills when I'm thinking about the last, moving to what literature, the the last novels of Cormac McCarthy. I'm now reading it. He recently passed away. Of course, you all know about it. The greatest, possibly the greatest American writer of our era. After his previous book was The Row, about post-apocalyptic America. And when I see the footage from Ukraine, I'm thinking about The Row a lot. And his last two novels, they connected. They're about brother and sister, or sibling, who are children of the scientists who created the nuclear bomb. So someone, it's a fictional character, but who's of course, again, Oppenheimer. Why artists could predict this, I have no idea. How they did, I have no idea. But it's an important moment. The first moment in years, in many, many years, when the humanity seriously thinks about nuclear. What does it mean? So I think art nowadays, after the war started, next couple of months, I was also under the big impression of idea that art doesn't matter anymore. That we all don't need this cinema, literature, film criticism, of course, and it's useless and absurd. But now I feel different. The whole year I'm traveling a lot, giving these lectures, public talks, and you know, many local people in the audience, in Tashkent or I mean everywhere, in Zurich, in Luxembourg, I travel everywhere, in Canada, and many Ukrainians too. And for them, these answers which come from art is also important. But we don't have immediate answers about this war, because now the reality is still much stronger. When we see the explosion on Crimean bridge, when we see how Ukrainian army enters Kherson, it's so strong, no fiction can compare to it. No Spielberg, no Terrence Malick, nobody could, no Christopher Nolan could match it with the best actors in the world.
We have time perhaps for one or two more questions. Yes, be sure to say who you are.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Sam. I'm an entering graduate student here at Pitt in the film studies program. I have a few questions, but thinking about this conversation, I want to ask, going back to this question of the fifth wave and like preserving like the Russian intelligentsia in exile, could you speak about the reception of Russian culture that you've experienced in Latvia these past few months? Is there anything to share?
Well, I can say that official politics in Latvia is really against everything they can imagine as a Russian propaganda. And everything Russian can be seen as propaganda. It's a little bit paranoid view. But at the same time, myself and some of my friends, when we have public talks or when we show films and discuss them with local audience, majority, it's not audience of Russians who flew to Latvia. The reception is great. People are really receptive. They're very kind. And I had a lot of, again, when it's not on the internet, when are real people. Even taxi drivers, there's a big myth about taxi drivers being the most aggressive. I had a lot of taxi drivers, local people, speaking Russian with an accent, who recognized me and said how happy they are that me and my family we've chosen Latvia to live, to stay, and that they want to watch some film with me presenting this film, and it was really touching for me, really touching. And I'm glad we spent this year and a half in Latvia. I'm not sure about the future, really. We don't have nothing about it. And it's tough with documents. Even to get visa for Russian in Latvia now it's problematic. And to get permanent residence or permission to work, it's hell. It's much worse than in Western Europe. But at the same time, my younger kid, he's in school, and he has no conflicts with other kids and Ukrainian kids. They're all very friendly, and he now speaks Latvian. He's very proud of it. So we have Latvian friends, new friends, and Ukrainian friends. And I know that it can sound like a little bit utopic. And maybe it's because I'm well-known person and they know my views. Of course, it's also important. But I don't see it as a definitive wall between all Russians and all people in Baltic states. It's not that. But maybe it will be if the war will be for another year or 2 or 3. It's bad. Sometimes it's bad. People are scared. People are traumatized. Everyone is traumatized. Even people who are not directly touched by the war. And we are traumatized. And in period of such a trauma, of course, many conflicts are possible. And the internet doesn't help in it. No. Unfortunately, internet sometimes it's a battlefield of total hatred of everyone towards everyone. Sometimes I think it's just the boats paid by Kremlin, but it's not always that, unfortunately.
So we perhaps have time for one more question. Yes. Say who you are, if you don't mind.
Hey, I'll try to introduce myself in Russian. So, привет, меня зовут Roman. Я учусь в университете Питтсбурге.
Speak a little bit louder, I can't hear you.
Я учусь в университете Pittsburgh. My question is, so the reason why I'm here studying Russian and the language and the culture and the people is because I want to understand. I was wondering, is there any like movie or any piece of media that I can show like my friends, my family, to help them understand as well? Just like the entire thing, because it's very complex from what I can hear. That's all. So
To understand the war or to understand the current situation?
I think the best thing, if you can understand Russian language, the best thing you can do is to watch YouTube. YouTube videos by Yuri Dud, by Katerina Gordeeva, by some other people, Lev Schlossberg, what he's doing. He's a politician inside Russia, so it's important and interesting. And there are people who are alive, imperfect, who try to express what they feel. It's better than art for now to understand what's going on in Russia. Really. And I think I can permit myself to say that it's good to read Medusa. I write for Medusa, of course, I'm not objective, but I really believe it's the best Russian language media nowadays, which reflects what's going on. Medusa has now a record readership. It's like, I believe it's 20 million people, readers every week. It's a lot. All over the world. And in Russia, outside Russia, in Russia. Medusa, I think they have everything. A bit of culture, of sociology, of reportage, everything. Even official chronic from Kremlin is there. So I really advise you and your friends to have Medusa as your small window to the world of Russia. To understand Russia, nobody can. Remember Tuchev, it's very important. There's no person in the world who can understand Russian. You can be born in Russia, live in Russia all your life, you still don't understand it. You can be afraid of it, you can be charmed by it, you can love Russia, you can hate Russia, but to understand, no. Nobody can.
There's a very interesting English speaker called Mark Galeotti. I think if I would pick out one, it's very harsh. It's a very harsh point of view, but if I were to pick out somebody to read, it would be probably Mark Galeotti, and also Michael Kaufman, Kofman, who does military stuff, analysis of Ukraine and Russia. Those are the two that I would pick. But like many of us here, I get up in the morning and I read Medusa. The first thing when I open my eyes, I read Medusa.
Yeah, I do the same, and my wife, we are living like this. We didn't do it before the war. I worked for Medusa for, I don't remember already, maybe 7, 8 years. But I never read Medusa as constantly as now. But now I live with Medusa, and I have this push from my phone with every news. Every new thing I see, I read because I think it's always important, and it unfortunately the majority of them connected with the war, and I want to know what's going on.
Just a quick follow-up
Yeah.
on the Oppenheimer. Do you think, Anton, it's a coincidence Christopher Nolan's film coming out now, or is it kind of an urgent implementation of a plan?
It's a coincidence, but it's this kind of coincidence always happen with big artists. They can feel it. They have an antenna to feel what's going on in the world. And Nolan was always interested in such things. I mean, the war and the influence of war, the possibility of war in Tenet, the influence of past wars in Dunkirk. He was always interested in this. So I think it's quite logical for him to do this. But for all of us, I haven't seen the film. I cannot judge it. Maybe it's not really a great film. I have no
Well, it
idea.
didn't come out yet, right?
Yeah, but I really want to see it, and I believe it's going to answer some questions. But sometimes very old films answer many questions. Recently, we now live for summer in Silver Spring. It's a suburb of Washington D.C. It's a great place because they have one of the best, my favorite, cinema theater in America. It's an old historical cinema built in I believe 38, and it's a theater by American Film Institute. So they show all kinds of old films and sometimes new films as well. For example, Oppenheimer, they will show it on 70 millimeters film, and we are planning to go, of course, to see it on screen like this. So recently, me and my son, who is there, who is student of cinema as well, we were seeing an old film by Douglas Sirk, Time to Love and Time to Die. I never seen it before. I read the book because many Russians have read Erich Maria Remarque, who is a very important writer for Russian culture, for Russian tradition. And especially this book, which is about experiences of soldier of Wehrmacht who have lived, who can go to his house for a few weeks and then go back. It reminded me as a film 20 Days Without War of Alexei German, which was made later. And this is a great film. Actually, a screenplay was written by Remarque, and he acted himself in the film as an anti-fascist professor. And this film about a very simple guy, good guy, who participated in mass killing of Ukrainian partisans in the beginning of the film, and who, this is a big spoiler, who liberates these partisans in the end when he goes back. And what they do, they take a rifle and they shoot him. So this film, it's a Hollywood movie, it's 50s. Conventional melodrama in the English language, of course, a love story. But it gives the answers to majority of questions we ask ourselves every day now. it's good and bad, nothing new under the moon. And sometimes old cinema can give us some answers better than new films.
Okay, one last question. Oh yes, I didn't forget you. Yeah, let's hear this question, and if we can stay fairly quick, let's get them both. Go ahead, please.
Right.
Say who you are. If that's all
Yeah,
right.
Vladimir. Not completely changing the subject, but some way. It's about Iranian movie. It's in general starting from my favorite Baron and going by Panahi, Majid, and so on. But it's a little bit way in the back. What's in common is the life of creative people under the suppression dictatorship and so on. So what's present modern condition of Iranian movies?
I think there are many similarities. Actually, my first discovery for myself when the war started that my answers to questions to Russian intelligentsia, to my colleagues who make films, are in Destiny and films of Jafar Panahi, who is the only one, I think, in the world right now who is fighting and who is ready to go to prison for making his films and still to make these films. Because when Kirill Serebrennikov, a friend of mine as well, when he went to prison, it was supposedly for economical reasons. And Panahi was imprisoned because of his work. And he was still doing it. When he was liberated after a few months of prison, and he was banned from filmmaking, the first thing he started to make at home, he took his iPhone or smartphone and started to film with it and made a film. And the title was "This is not a film," and he sent it to the Cannes Festival, and so on and so on. So you can fight with the cinema. And I wrote a book about Panahi. I'm very proud about this work, honestly, because it was my answer even to myself about what film in genre or filmmaker can do in such circumstances. Some of my colleagues believe that filmmaker should stay silent and do nothing because there is war. I disagree. Some of my colleagues think that you should just go fight and not, and of course, if you're Ukrainian, you can understand that. Oleg Sentsov, who is a friend of mine as well, he's now fighting. But I think when you have talent, your best weapon, it's your art. So under the regime, you can always do something. You are always at risk, but you can do something. And all answers, there are multiple answers about the question of similarities of two regimes are in my books. There are differences, of course, because a religious totalitarian state is different from the state of Putin. It's different types of censorship, let's say. And sometimes it's easier for Panahi, sometimes it's more risky for Panahi. It's more like hybridный, more hybrid regime for censorship in Russia. But we can learn a lot watching independent Iranian cinema, you're right. It's really useful. And the last film of Panahi, I believe, is very important as well because it's all about immigration, about staying or leaving the country. It's called No Bears, and that's last year the Expo Festival won a special prize.
I apologize for having ignored you when I went to Katie for the question. So can I offer you to? You had your hand up before.
I had a question. Thank you so much for this very personal, genuine conversation. Really appreciate that. My question was about cancel culture, and you already mentioned, you touched upon that a little bit. Like you said, you can't kill art, but I was wondering what do you think about this? Is this a new phenomenon? What do you think about cancel culture? Are there other examples? And do you believe that you can really cancel a culture? I'm personally torn apart. My kids' school organized like a cultural carnival, and usually I would go and talk about Russian culture. Obviously, for obvious reasons, I didn't go this year. But then I don't want I want, you know, beautiful works of art and culture to be preserved. So how do you
And besides
compromise?
you guys, would you like to tuck in a question? Did you have your hand up beside the woman? Yeah, why don't we tuck your question in and then we've got to close it down. Go ahead.
Thank you.
We'll put the two questions together.
So my name is Katya, and my question would be kind of, let's dream about the best case scenario, like if the war would end, like how it will end, and what will happen, and what the post-war Russia will look like. Will all the people who left Russia go back to it, or will the Russia dissolve into different countries? On your point of view, what will be the base case scenario?
I will say it's, of course, it's a huge question. I don't have really an answer. I have an opinion. I think that Russia will be totally different after Putin and after this war. How different? Of course, I don't know. But I know that if Russia will be democratic, and I sincerely hope for it, it will be the best time ever, maybe after Eisenstein and Ziegfeld of first experiences in cinema, the best time for Russian cinema. We have so many suppressed subjects and stories to tell. So new Russian cinema of the next generation will be really strong and great. Russian cinema, not cinema in exile, I'm afraid. Because in exile, producers not so interested in such things. And about Russia, as always, some people will return, some people not. Who can say? It all depends on how and when war will end, what was going to be with the politics, with the economics. Huge question. About cancel culture as well, it's a huge question. I think there are different parts in it. Of course, it's not a new phenomenon. Some parts of culture were suppressed and banned and censored for years. And for example, nationalistic cultures like Ukrainian one or Belarusian one were suppressed in Stalin times. Was it a cancel culture or just censorship? Where the difference? It's a big question. And the biggest cancellation of culture now happens in Russia. They really do cancel all kind of liberty in arts, in literature, in theater, in poetry, in music. I mean, it's obvious. And compared to this, even the angriest Ukrainian activists who fight for cancellation of Russians abroad, it's a very small phenomenon. We all sometimes really touched by it, and on very personal level. And we start to protect Pushkin or Dostoevsky or Tarkovsky from cancellation. I don't believe such things possible. If art is real and great, it cannot be cancelled. Not by the regime, not by the activists. It's just impossible. But I think, really, the celebration of greatness of Russian classical art shouldn't be made when the war is going on. On ethical level, you can ask me, but what's about scholars? What's about science? Of course, they should do the same what they're doing. Of course. Just all public celebration, they are used by propaganda. They love it. They love it. You see now in Paris there's new monument for Pushkin. Great, so they don't cancel it. They scream about cancel culture. Then they scream Russian culture is not cancelled, it's our victory. And they present it as victory of Putin. So I think the best way is just a year or 2 years or 3 years. Fortunately, it can be longer than that, but not eternally. When the war is going on, if you support Ukraine, if you want Ukraine to win, you don't have to. For example, me, I want that Ukraine win this war. Really. I think the best way to behave, for now, and it's not to celebrate Russian culture, but what is celebration? I think if Russian director, who is not financed by Russian state, make a great film, and this film is invited to Cannes Film Festival or Venice Film Festival, it's normal. If such film is great and it win a prize, it's normal, it's okay. If Ukrainians want to protest, it's also okay. In a democratic society, it's their right to protest. And the right of jury not to be influenced by this, or to be influenced. That's it. It's very simple. Art can regulate itself, I believe. I don't think that even Putin in Russia, who has all his power, can really cancel the culture. So activists, they're not able to do that. But the ethical dimension of it should be remembered. And there are also many other layers of that. Sometimes we Russians, we cannot divide the art from propaganda. Monuments of Pushkin in every city of Ukraine, it is propaganda. And it always was. It's not about Pushkin's poetry. Absolutely not. It never was. There is a great film by Yuri Mamin, Bakitbardi. It's a great film. The Pushkin can be the tool of propaganda as much as Lenin or Stalin. And it's not about his poetry. No one cares about it. And no one tries to cancel poetry. But the post-imperialistic analysis and research of Pushkin or Brodsky or whoever, of course it's a good thing to do, and it always was. It's not canceling, it's researching. It's just like all Russia screamed for some reasons when they put some preface before Gone by the Wind, explaining that it's really a film with some racial prejudices shown, but still a great movie. Why not? It cannot change the movie, but it gives some extra information, which is important. I believe that we never did the same work for Russian classical culture. Russian school program of Russian literature was never really changed since Stalin times. Do you know it? It was constructed in Stalin times for pure propaganda goals. Why we all know by heart from the school Borodino by Lermontov and not «Выхожу один на дорогу»? For what reason? Because someone one day chosen this and said, all children should know it to be proud of their country. It's good to reflect on these things. It's not canceling Lermontov.
It's an interesting fact that if one looks at film and media syllabi, the field in which I work, in the United States, the film that is the most put on all undergraduate and graduate film syllabi is not, for example, Spike Lee, not, for example, Citizen Kane, but Dziga Vertov. Now, that's all by itself an interesting fact, because the question is not should it be or not be Dziga Vertov, but rather where does Dziga Vertov come from? Is he a Russian filmmaker? And so the job really is to reimagine what Dziga Vertov is like if we take him out of the context of Soviet filmmaking and of Russian filmmaking. We look at him through a different spectrum, then we have a different story to tell. And I think that new story is a story that can help us to be perhaps more optimistic about a kind of a new approach to
But
culture.
I'm sorry to say just one more small thing, that as I said, I travel a lot, last year and a half, everywhere in the world, There are Russian music, Russian operas, Russian plays, Russian books. I was in Luxembourg. I went to the only one bookshop in the center next to the palace. And almost all books, it was one Ukrainian book in the vitrine, and 10 Russian books. Everyone now really interested in Russian culture. I think, actually, now it's another peak of interest towards Russian culture. It's not cancel, it's the opposite. But there are some problems as well, and of course it exists because there is a war, and cultural war as well. And Ukrainian, they fight this war, and we can do nothing about it.
So, as I close this down, I want to encourage you to think about subscribing to the center that we represent here, Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies. We have a weekly newsletter. If you want to be part of it, to get it once a week, you would write to Reese, Google Pitt Reese, and you'll find it. The person to whom you will be writing is sitting right here up front, so be gentle with her. Do not be mean to her, because it will come back to the rest of us. She's a gentle soul, and I was looking today at what is the word in Russian for grace, and there's a million, but I think the correct word is probably milosердие, not благодать or изящность or грациозность or any of those other apparent synonyms to milosердие. If you could bring some milosердие not only to our team, but also come to our events. We would welcome you. We don't see your faces there. We do all kinds of very interesting things in exactly this room. Now you know where this room is. May you meet next time, not only when we invite Anton again, but may you meet in the fall when you've signed up for our newsletter and you can see some of the really interesting events that we organized here. Thank you very much for coming. Let's have a round of applause.